Hi, my name is S.Turner, and welcome to another edition of the Gesher Galicia Today podcast. We are thrilled to have with us today Bennett Greenspan of Family Tree DNA. Entrepreneur and lifelong genealogy enthusiast Bennett Greenspan founded Family Tree DNA in 2000. Family Tree DNA was the first company in the world to develop DNA testing for ancestry and genealogical purposes into a commercial business. The Y chromosome test, the company's original product, started the direct to consumer genetics testing revolution. Mr. Greenspan's business and entrepreneur experience spans photo imaging and commercial real estate. Hi, Bennett. Welcome to the Gesher Galicia Today podcast.
Hello, Stephen. It's good to be with you.
Okay, great. So, genealogy was always a passion of yours, but what started your interest in genetic genealogy?
Wow. Um, so in 1999, after having sold my photographic supply company and hanging around the house perhaps a little bit too much, um, my wife, noticing that I was always around the house, suggested to me that I learn how to play golf or that I pick up my genealogy, which I had picked up and put down and picked up and put down many times. Because when I ran into a paper trail roadblock, I gave up on that line, and I kind of gave up on researching for a while because it was frustrating. And so, in 1999, I had worked on one of my lines at the suggestion of my wife. And I then entered the name in a place that we're all familiar with called Jewish Gen at the Jewish Gen Family Finder. And I found someone looking and researching the same last name as my mother's father, except they were living in Buenos Aires. And they had similar names to the members of the family who had come to America. Um, one of them was born in the same village that my grandmother was actually born in. And so I had naming conventions, I had geography in common, but I didn't have a piece of paper. I didn't have what we genealogists consider sacrosanct as far as evidence. And so I was thinking about my problem and probably crying in my beer, so to speak. And I realized there had been a television show a couple years, or an article a couple years earlier, where they had done DNA testing on the Kohanim. And I realized that was done with the male inherited Y chromosome. And I said, why can't I do that? And so that was really the beginning of the beginning.
Oh, well, and we're all thankful for that. Now, you are a Galiciana, right?
I am a Galicianer on my mother's, I'm sorry, on my father's father's mother's side. We hail from a place just north of the Carpathian Mountains called Żmigrod Novi. And I actually visited Żmigrod Novi in the summer of 1979. And I actually had the opportunity to meet a few people who knew my relatives before they died in World War II.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, how did you go from that story to the mechanics of starting Family Tree DNA?
Well, what happened was I realized that the Kohanim testing and the Jefferson testing had been done with the Y chromosome, and I knew that I needed to use the Y chromosome also. So I got on the internet and I started doing some research, and I researched to the point that I realized that there was only one American as a co-author on either of those two papers. And so the next morning I got up and I looked on the internet and I found the co-author of the Kohanim paper, a fellow named Dr. Michael Hammer from the University of Arizona. And so I just found his phone number and I called him. And he wasn't very interested in talking to me. He's an academic. He's not a genealogist at all. And I asked him, "Well, would you do a test?" And he told me no, they only did it for academic purposes. And I said, "That's okay. Um, Honestly, I just want to write a check, and I want to get a couple of kits, and I want to test my cousin in California and this potential cousin in Argentina to determine if they're related. That will work, won't it?" And he said, "Of course it'll work." And I said, okay. He said, but I don't know anyone that's offering this kind of testing commercially anywhere in the world. And I was stunned by that answer and momentarily speechless. And in that pause, with me being speechless and Dr. Hammer just listening to this genealogist on the other end of the phone, so to speak, he blinked first. He said, someone should start a company like this because I get phone calls from crazy genealogists like you all the time. And I
Right.
said, Dr. Hammer, I know you're busy. I know you're trying to get out of town to go speak at a conference in Spain. I'm going to spend the rest of the weekend and write a business plan and tell you what I would do if I, as a genealogist, had the opportunity to run a company such as this. And so I went from trying to hang on the phone with him to hear any glimmer of hope to knowing that I needed to get off the phone with him and I needed to get a business plan in his hands. And a couple of weeks later, I sent him a business plan, and eventually we got it approved by the University of Arizona. They decided that they would offer the testing to me on a commercial basis through Arizona Research Labs, which is the commercial arm of the University of Arizona.
Now, did you have any biology background? Zero. Okay.
Zero.
Okay.
We had one relative in our family from Philadelphia, uh, who had done really well in the 50s. And he had an expression, and that was personality can hire brains.
Um, I like that. I like that.
And so I was in a situation where I was leaning on the brains of the University of Arizona's molecular lab for science and evolution, and I just, so to speak, was the face of genetic genealogy.
Okay. So when did you expand from just Y DNA?
We launched the Y-DNA test in probably late April or early May of 2000. And that was the same week that Dr. Brian Sykes launched an mtDNA test. And he had plans to offer a Y-DNA test shortly thereafter. But when he saw that we launched with our 12 marker Y-DNA test, he said, well, these 4 Y-DNA markers I'm offering aren't enough. And so he went back to the drawing board. And so uh, a couple months after we launched the Y-DNA test, let's say midsummer 2000, we offered the mtDNA test. And then around Christmas time of 2000, Dr. Sykes came back and started offering a Y-DNA test. So by January 1st, 2001, both his company and our company were offering an initial Y-DNA test and an HVR1, or the initial um, control region of the mitochondria.
And how much later did the autosomal testing come about?
Autosomal testing came out in 2008 at 23andMe, and it came out 1 year later, 2009, at Family Tree DNA.
Okay. Now you say that like you have a love-hate relationship with autosomal testing. So you want to get into that?
Right. So when I started the company, we assumed a requirement to educate our customers. And when you're talking science to non-science majors, it's really helpful to try to keep the explanations short and clean. And Y chromosome and mitochondria testing fit in perfectly with that definition. I could say to a man or a woman, look, if you're looking for a Stein because your mother's father was a Stein, you needed to go to any of your male cousins who are Steins, and they would have the Stein Y chromosome. And if you were looking on your mother's direct line, you could figure out who was the daughter of the daughter of the daughter of the person who was your target. And it was very, very clear. With
But
autosomal,
excuse me, I'll just say, not so clear for Galicianas, where there are siblings that have different surnames, one from the mother and one from the father.
you're right, but you know that we Galicianers are special.
Oh, yes, that we know.
So I'm talking about the rules for everybody else,
For
not
everybody
necessarily the
else.
rules for us.
Right, right.
So with the autosomal DNA, all those sexual lines were thrown out. They didn't matter. In effect, like I used to say, and like we made a T-shirt for the IAJGS, I believe in 2009, when we launched the product, we said sex doesn't matter anymore because the sexual lines with autosomal were thrown out. Now, the good news is I could show I was related to someone with that autosomal DNA. The bad news is couldn't figure out how. Whereas with the Y chromosome, you always knew it was your dad's male line. And with the mitochondria, you always knew that it was a woman's mother's lineage that you were tracking back to. Whereas with autosomal, which was absolutely wonderful because it allowed everyone to play, it left a lot of questions and still does as to exactly how I'm related to those individuals. But the tools are getting better and they're getting more automated, and eventually it will be quite easy to determine that you're related and how you're related using autosomal.
Okay. Now, there's a big social media controversy. You see it all the time on social media. Where is the best place for Jews to test? I advocate for family tree DNA, but other people advocate for ancestry because it's a larger database. But I sort of like to have the tools that we get with family tree DNA. How do you respond to that question?
Well, let me say this. There are three different tests we're talking about. We're talking about the autosomal DNA test. And when you want to compare your autosomal DNA, it's good to be in multiple databases. So I would say that it's probably most practical to get yourself initially tested for autosomal DNA at either Ancestry or at MyHeritage, who also has quite a large database, especially I think for Jewish people. Um, and then take those autosomal results and transfer them for free or for a very small fee into into one of the databases that accept, and that would be Ancestry, and that would be MyHeritage or Family Tree DNA. However, if you are looking at your male inherited Y chromosome, which every single Jewish male on the planet should do, there's only one place to test, and that's family tree DNA. The
Right.
same thing is true for the autosomal. If you really want to compare yourself to other people on your mother's line, the family tree DNA database is not only the largest, it's the only one that caters to that need.
Right. Now, I have to say that there's quite a great move on your part, and an altruistic move in the sense that you're advising people, maybe test an ancestry and then import it for free, where, you have to pay, I think, $20 to use the tools, but you could do the import for free. And you're not making money off these people, but you're advising them that that might be a good path to take for people. So I admire you for that. Okay, and other companies gave up on Y-DNA and mtDNA testing. Why do you think?
Well, honestly, I think that our lead over ancestry.com was so large in the Y chromosome and in the mitochondria space that they couldn't compete. And so that's why uh, when autosomal came about, Ancestry jumped into it. They gave the first 10,000 people who ordered a test from them, they got it for free. They've been very, very liberal with you know, encouraging people to come into their database. But you have to understand that it's part of their business model. What Ancestry wants is they want you to sign up for their, comprehensive world package, and they want you to do it every year. By the way, so does MyHeritage. Um, those packages are between $200 and $300 every year. The autosomal test that Family Tree DNA sells is $79, and it's a one-time purchase. The same is true with the Y chromosome and the mitochondria. So we have different models. I would argue that they have a much better business model than we do because they have the subscription, which Wall Street seems to very much like. They don't like models like we have, where we simply sell you a product and then tell you call us when you have a question and call us anytime you have a question. That doesn't work so well if we had a $10 a month subscription fee, uh, which in general customers don't like, but Wall Street loves. Then I'm sure the company would get more respect in those, from Wall Street because of its different business model.
Right. Okay. Have you had any success stories in your own personal tree that you found new relatives through DNA?
Huge. Um, I spoke at the IAJGS last year and explained what I had been doing for the last couple of years since my partner Max and I sold Gene by Gene or Family Tree DNA in January of 2021. And what I've been doing is I've been encouraging and, when necessary, sponsoring a big Y test at Family Tree DNA for everyone that matches my Y chromosome. And by doing that, I've been able to build a phylogeny, a theoretical construct of how evolution has taken place um, within my male line. And it goes back to what I like to say was my first Jewish ancestor, my first Jewish ancestor that I can track. I don't know his name, but I know his mutation. Um, uh, he lived about 165 CE, and he had two descendant lines, both of whom have Jewish people on them. That's how I know that he had to have been a Jewish guy. Um, it appears to me that he was probably living in Spain. Um, that would be according to Occam's razor, which is basically keep it, simple, silly. Um, uh, According to Occam's razor, you would say that my ancestor probably at that time was probably in Spain. So a Spanish guy, 30 years after the Bar Kokhba disaster, isn't in Judea, where his ancestors have lived in the Middle East for thousands of years. We know that by archaeological digs. But we find him in Spain. It looks like he may have gone to the end of the earth to survive, but retain his Judaism. And then I've been able to track descendants of those lines as they left Spain. I've been able to go back um, to study about the history of Spain as it relates to the Jews in particular. And so I have some I think reasonable assumptions uh, as to likely, what happened to the family, how it was influenced, how it split, how some stayed in Spain, and stayed in Spain for another 1,500 years. And on those lines, I find descendants who some have stayed in Spain and some have gone to Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria as Spanish Jews. And so it's interesting, although I've always thought of myself as an Ashkenazi Jew,
Right.
now I realize that those terms, Ashkenazi and Sephardic, are all about time and place, because my ancestors clearly would have been called Sephardic had they been living in Spain in 165 CE. But when they eventually left Spain, probably by the 600s, maybe close to the 700s, when they left there and started moving towards Central Europe. They moved from a Spanish world and Spanish speaking world to a German speaking world. And so they became acculturated as Ashkenazim. And we've seen many examples of this, surprising examples of this.
Well, I could tell you that you and I had a common ancestor according to the Big Y test, 28,000 years BCE.
Well, that's even a little bit before religion began.
Right.
So I'm going to have to refer to you as a very distant cousin.
Very, very, well, you need a few berries in there. Okay, well, I could tell you. Okay, well, let me just first say that whenever I talk to anybody about DNA, I tell them that you need to test a generation above you or as far above you as you can go. Because DNA, as we know, gets diluted every generation. And I'll give you, you want to say something?
Well, what I was going to say is that is true only if you're studying the autosomal
Yeah,
DNA.
exactly. Exactly. Unless there's a mutation somewhere along the line in the Y in the DNA and the empty DNA, which happens very slowly. But this is an autosomal test. So I tested my mother, who was then in her 90s, and we tested my in-laws. And one day I get an email from Tree DNA on of someone who matches my mother, and the numbers were huge. Okay, it was over 400 something centimorgans. Now it's listed as 288 centimorgans with a longest segment of 102 centimorgans. And I knew this was a real test. A name totally not familiar. Okay, I spoke to my mother, who was alive then, and she didn't know the name from anywhere. So I sent him an email praying that he would respond to me. And I get an email back. I gave him my ancestral surnames, the towns in Galicia that were involved, and he wrote me back. He said he's a man in his 80s. He lives in Israel. He says he has no idea about DNA, but his grandson asked him to make a test. And none of the names look familiar, but there's one town. He goes, my grandmother was from Shendishev, which is where my grandmother was from. So it took a while But we eventually realized our grandmothers were named after the same person. We had the same great great grandmothers. And this was a branch that no one knew survived the Holocaust. Okay, they were still in Europe. We were in the United States, and it opened up a whole avenue, a whole branch. Uh, this stuff works. This stuff works, and everyone should try to test their elders with autosomal if they can. Okay. So I wanted to throw out that story there. Oh, and I wanted to say that his numbers with me were nothing exceptional. 135 centimorgans total, 28 longest segment. And that's like, I have tens, maybe hundreds of matches with that range. I never would have further written him. But the fact that my mother tested and she had a large match opened the door for that test.
That was a great explanation for why we should test the oldest generation possible.
Right,
Thank you. That was
right.
very good. Everyone
O-
should dwell on that.
Okay. So one of the reasons that I like family tree DNA so much is because of the tools you offer. Okay. And to me, the most important tool is the chromosome browser. Explain why that is important for people studying autosomal DNA.
Well, the DNA breaks up in every generation. We get smaller and smaller segments of DNA from our various grandparents or great grandparents or great great grandparents. And so the ability to take up two or four, or I think as many as six people that are on your match list and to be able to put them on a chromosome browser so that you can look for pileups, which would be where a part of on my chromosome 6, I match you and I match a third person, then in effect, we know that you and I and that third person all received that chunk of DNA from a single one of our great great grandparents. And so the ability to do that gives you clues as to how you are related to that rather impressive list of matches that everyone who has four Jewish grandparents will have. I mean, it's over 35,000 people who show up on the match list of an Ashkenazi Jew, just giving you an idea of how many, many, many Ashkenazim, we have within our database. And we have all those Ashkenazim because, we tried to work hard to create ourselves as Jewish DNA Central because, being Jewish, it mattered to us. I mean, we're an equal opportunity tester, but if I had another 100,000, Jews in the database, you would only see a bigger smile on my face.
Okay. Now, another thing that you have that's unique to Family Tree that I love is projects. Okay. I am the administrator of 4 projects.
Mhm.
I started projects for each of my grandparents. Okay. And those projects are awesome. And I shouldn't say for my grandparents. I started for the shtetl where they came
Mhm.
from, and we've had success stories within our projects of branches reconnecting that didn't know it survived the Holocaust, and it's a fabulous thing to have. And there are all different kinds of projects. There are geographic projects, there are surname projects, and people who test with Family Tree or import your data if you test an ancestry or something. That's a good reason to import your data into Family Tree so you could join a project. And I, encourage people through my talks and I have shtetl research groups that say you need to input, and they tell me, well, I tested in a different company. I said, you need to import your data into Family Tree so you could join our project and see how you match other people from the shtetl. And that's a great thing that you have. But I have one complaint. Okay.
Well, now,
Okay. Uh, Within the project, when I try to do a family finder group report, I get an error report, 500 internal service error, that I have too many matches. So they can't give me that report because
Mhm.
there are too many matches. It didn't used to be, but some upgrade to your system or something like that generates that error and takes away a tool that we need to use. Now I've contacted support. I've spoken to them. And they said they're working on the issue. But I figure now, since I have the big guy here, I'll bring it to you personally.
So, in the last email that I sent you, if you noticed my name block, it had under my name, it had the word emeritus.
Okay.
Which is another way of saying that in January of 2001, Max and I sold our interests in the company and effectively retired. Max was able to walk away completely because I'm a genealogist. I wasn't able to get that far, and I got drafted from time to time to speak on this, but. Um, I would say that internal server error is probably the result of success. In other words, there are so many, there's, oh gosh, there are so many um, people who have tested with us at Family Tree DNA that it puts a lot of load on the server. And there were two suggestions. Suggestion number one was restrict the number of matches that the customers get to see. And number two was for the very small number of people who get these internal server errors, we'll work on it, but at least everyone else will continue to be able to get their matches.
So there
And
is hope that this will be resolved.
yeah, certainly they want it resolved, and I know there. I just saw um, last week a list of bugs that were being worked on because they do include me on those things because I like to go to these shows, and when I go to shows, people ask me questions, and they want me to be able to say the right thing, so they are sharing a little bit of their internal roadmap, with me.
Okay,
Um,
good.
so
Well,
that's
another thing that I like, the way Family Tree presents the matches, is that they divide matches by maternal and paternal.
yes,
And
absolutely.
that's a really, really big help. And it doesn't necessarily have to be. I was fortunate that I was able to test my mother, but not everybody is so fortunate. But if you put a family tree and you link
Hmm.
the tree to your DNA, then they could determine through known matches to known cousins what unknown matches, whether they're maternal or paternal, and that's a really really big help.
Right. I've found it to be very helpful too. And when I was still at the company, I always used myself as a guinea pig because I understand my genealogy better than I understand anybody else's. So I would end up looking at the 15 or 20 cousins I have in a case like this to make sure that all the cousins on my dad's side had a blue uh, symbol next to it, and all the ones who were related on mom's side had a pink symbol, and then of course we always have some that have both because most Ashkenazi Jews don't have 64 great 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 grandparents. We have
Right.
62, we have 59, um, God forbid even less. Um, but there was a lot of marriage within, which is why the average Ashkenazi Jew has a little bit more DNA in common um, with unrelated people than the average Irishman or the average person from Poland's going to have, even though those populations, were also, with the case of the Irish, they were on an island, and so you don't get to, leave your island very much. So you tend to procreate with people who are around you, which was the same case as the Ashkenazi Jews, but we tended to do that a little bit more, maybe a lot more, because um, marriage within was very important to us, and I think it was also very important to the non-Jews that they ended up not marrying one of us, and so there was double reasons why we tended to marry within.
Now, a few years ago, you redid your formulas where a lot of the matches got shorter. Um, could you explain what happened when, like, it seems like you took out, uh, I think with further research on the autosomal, they decided like a lot of DNA segments were in common over a broad population, so it wasn't like relevant to a particular match. But it just seemed to me, anecdotally, that looking at matches, that they became shorter and more relevant.
And more relevant. So I'm not intimately familiar with this. I do know that from time to time, um, every company that's in science needs to, clean up its, prior assumptions with further knowledge. And because the amount of DNA in common is pivotal towards the company's prediction of how closely or how far, related you are. Um, I know that that would be a priority for the company to make sure that those are as absolutely rock solid and accurate as possible.
Okay, good. Now you say that Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA are not relevant in the genealogical time frame. But tell us why those tests are still important to do.
Well, first of all, now that family tree DNA offers the entire DNA sequence in a test that's called the Big Y, the statement that you attributed to me is no longer accurate. In other words, I can look at any of the 150 people on my Y37 match list, and I can't tell you when I'm related to them or how I'm related to them. But when we do the entire sequence test, in other words, when we look at the entire Y chromosome. We look at maybe, let's say, functionally 25 million bases, and we sequence it, and we say, you have this mutation, and this guy has this mutation, but this guy doesn't have this mutation, then he can't be related down here. He's got to be related up somewhere. Um, we can now tell any of those people on my match list when they're related to me and how they're related to me. And we couldn't do that 5 years ago. This is the big breakthrough on the Y chromosome that has allowed us to come up with with some very interesting information. For example, I can now tell you and all of my Galicianer cousins that even those lit fox, but I can tell you that we descend from approximately 700 men. That means that there were 700 men whose families track back and have multiple descendant lines that are Jewish that track back anywhere from 1,500 years ago to 3,000 years ago. We have 20 lineages that undisputably are from Temple 1 times. Temple 1. We have dozens of additional lineages that track back to Temple 2. Then we have other lineages, a lot of them, such as mine, which we can't even find a guy back into Temple 2 because all those guys probably likely didn't survive. And I'm a descendant of the one guy who got out of Judea, who got to Spain, who survived. But all of my collateral lines, those brother lines, look like they probably didn't survive. So, in effect, that lineage became what we call a saving remnant. And to me, that's been the biggest eye opener for morphing Jewish genealogy into real Jewish history, which is something that I've been interested in for a long time, but wasn't able to accomplish until we got this big Y really running well.
Well, it's fascinating, and it's a great breakthrough with the Big Y. And I will recommend to all the listeners, if they ever have a chance, to listen to Adam Brown speak. He gives a great presentation on just the evolution of the Jewish line from the Iron Ages and the Bronze Age and stuff like that. And it's fascinating. It's complicated. It's not so easy to follow, but it's truly fascinating. And I did the Big Y, like I said, and I love that you have a notable connections uh, part of the Big Y, and from that I found out that I am have a common ancestor from with the Rothschild family from about 1,300 years ago. I don't think that'll get me into any wills, but in the span of things, 1,300 years ago is not that far away. And about 30,000 years ago, I had a common ancestor with the Jordanian royal family. So now talk about how DNA, and this Y DNA in particular, has been used in political arguments both for and against Jews coming from the Levant.
Well, generally the arguments spoken about the Jews um, not coming from the Levant are the ones that don't employ DNA.
Right.
Certainly on the Y and on the mitochondria. Um, there are some people who have politicized the autosomal DNA. Let me put it this way. Um, a number of years ago, there was a Nobel Prize winner in economics who stated if you torture the data enough, it will confess. And that's what I'm seeing being done uh, generally on the part of our detractors, those people who want to say that Jews are from the Middle East will simply find ways to disregard our results. Um, but we know the truth. We know that at least 80% of all Y chromosomes held among those 700 unique lines, we know at least 80% of them hail from the Middle East. 80%. That means that at most, we were in the diaspora as Ashkenazi Jews for 20 years, for 2,000 years. Oh, I can you hang on a second? I apologize for this. So, by looking at the DNA of the Jewish people, it's pretty clear that we have a very strong Middle Eastern component. Ashkenazi Jews have a smaller Middle Eastern component than Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews have a smaller Middle Eastern, we have a larger Middle Eastern component than Ashkenazi, but they have a smaller Middle Eastern component than Mizrahi Jews who never left the Middle East. What that tells us is that when a people leaves its homeland, eventually some of its members marry with the folks who were in the general area. Um, and when that happened, maybe we lost them to Judaism and we never heard from them again. Um, but but the saving remnant, those that stayed within the group, even if there was intermarriage with outside the group, I think the group still worked very hard to retain its Jewish religion. And this is something that is totally of no interest on the part of our detractors, who, in my opinion, don't seem to really care whether they're mouthing the truth or not, as long as it fits their narrative. Um, and frankly, I'm still getting over the fact that Jesus was a Palestinian.
Yeah, right.
That's one of the harder ones for me to accept. But um, whether the Jews want to admit it or whether the Arabs want to admit it, we're cousins. And as I say in my speeches, there are Muslim Arabs, a lot of them, all over the Middle East. There are Christian Arabs, not nearly as many as there used to be. I mean, there's still some in Syria. There's still, a lot of Coptics in Egypt, but not nearly as many as there was, percentage-wise 50 or 100 years ago. But there's a third group of Arabs that we never talk about. And it's much to our discredit, in my opinion. They're Jewish Arabs. Because
Right.
what's an Arab? An Arab is a person who comes from Arabia. And uh, we don't think of ourselves as Jewish Arabs. We simply think of ourselves as Jews, but we are as Middle Eastern or Arabian as any of the Muslims or any of the Christians who were in the Middle East. We simply got into a fight with the Superman of our day 2,000 years ago when they tried to do things that defiled our temple. And I don't know whether we learned the lesson of not tugging on Superman's cape or not spitting into the wind, but the Jews fought for our religion in the same way that our Muslim and Christian cousins would fight for their religion if it was being defiled. Um, but 2,000 years ago, that was a battle that we lost.
Right.
And that's the only reason we're not in the Middle East.
Okay. I have one question about the big why that I have trouble understanding for myself. I have some matches that I'm closer to on the big Y that have a bigger geographic distance with me on the 110 STR test, the 110 marker test. So, why would that be?
Well, what that does is that shows you very clearly the weakness of the STR testing. In other words, STR testing does a great job of getting you in the vicinity of your relatives. Um, it may allow us to compare you to 1 million men in our database and show you the 150 that you're most closely related to. That's kind of akin to saying y'all are all in the same area code. But I can't tell you within an area code who lives closest to who. That we can't do with an area code. With the STR testing, I can't tell if someone has incremented or decremented, has gone from a 15 to a 16 or a 15 to a 14. And I can't see if the guy went from a 15 to a 16 for 3 generations and then popped back to a 15. I can't see that. So events that we can't observe in science, we have to treat them as if they didn't exist. But that doesn't mean they didn't happen. It just means that we can't observe them, therefore we can't count them. We don't have that problem when we do the big Y. We
Right.
are looking at mutations that move a single direction and don't flip back like the STRs do. Consequently, we can build that phylogeny very, very accurately by doing the big Y test.
Okay.
So now I only use the STRs to sift people so that I can see who's related to me and who's not. Forget the people who are not, but then the people who are related to me, even on the Y12 or the Y37, then if they show a connection to me, then I take them, if I can, straight to the big Y because I know I'll get the most accurate pinpoint result from that.
One thing that I want to mention that and why it's important to do Y-DNA and mtDNA testing, and you're the only game in town to really do a good test of that, is that no is also an answer.
That's
If
correct.
you're only studying your autosomal DNA and you find a match, and you want to study how you related to a match, if you have the haplogroups for the Y-DNA or the mtDNA and they don't match, you could eliminate a whole line of where to look for that match. So it may not give you something that's strictly in the time frame of 4 or 5 generations, but it could tell you where not to look. And that's a very important thing to remember when you're doing your DNA, that no is also an answer. Now, I want to just end up by saying, where do you see genetic DNA evolving in the future?
Well, for autosomal DNA, I see tools that will do a better job to automatically assemble how we are related to other people within our match list. And I think that there are various tools for that. They may or may not all be at the same companies, but I think as time goes on, as more and more of those tools become available, it'll become easier to sift through the DNA, the autosomal DNA, and have it help you make a genealogy. I see that coming. I don't know whether it's 2 years or 5 years, but I see us evolving in that direction. And that's because most people just want the answer. Most people don't want to do all the hard work and all the heavy lifting. They get their list of 30,000 or 35,000 matches and their eyes glaze over. And what they say then is, I thought this was going to help me with my genealogy. And well, we wanted to help you with your genealogy. So the way to make that happen would be, to provide tools that told you which people on your match list are likely related to your mother's mother, your mother's father, your father's mother, your father's father, and start bucketing your relatives back generation after generation, not just your grandparents, but your great grandparents. Can we bucket them into those 8 buckets? Tools like that and things that basically show these people are related and who they're related to or how. That'll be very, very helpful on the autosomal side. Uh, larger
Looking forward to
database,
that.
yes, larger databases on the Y chromosome side will make it easier and easier for a guy just to do a Y DNA test and to say, I did my DNA test and I found out that I'm not related to Rabbi Katzenellenbogen, but I'm related through 150 years before his line formed. He and I shared a common male ancestor. So uh, I see that happening more and more as more people subject themselves to a big Y test, and we get more people filling up in effect the scorecard. That's why I have called for a number of years. And Adam now quotes me as saying, uh, "I am interested in a census of the Jewish people." not a survey, which is what we've been doing for the last 20, 24 years. We've been doing a genetic survey of the Jewish people, and we have done such a good job that we know, uh, that we've learned so many things about the Ashkenazi Jews. But there are more things that we can learn. We'll be able to much more clearly see our migration pattern from Central Europe to Eastern Europe, which is not appreciated by the Jewish detractors who would like to be able to say that the Jews are the descendants of Khazars and that those Khazars move from east to west. Well, I'm sorry, the migration was from west to east, and not only does an understanding of Yiddish help in that area, but with my own DNA, I have been able to show that I am the descendant of the descendant of the descendant of someone whose DNA is found in Slovakia. And then 100 years later, I found them north of Slovakia on the Polish-Ukrainian border. And then 100 years later, I found them south of Kiev. And 50 years later, I found them in the Crimea. And so I know that's my migrational path since about 1500 to the late 1800s, where we were before we left Ukraine and came on my father's line and came to the United States. And so what you're able to do with the Y chromosome and what you're going to be able to do, I believe, as we get more and more of us who know where we're from in Europe tested, is we'll be able to really see migrational paths from Central Europe to Eastern Europe. And look, if that, I mean, that'll probably help us the most in rebutting those who, simply want to lie about the history of the Jews.
Well, I want to thank you so much. I think this was absolutely fascinating. Okay, it's not your typical DNA webinar or podcast or presentation, but this really goes into. We covered a lot of areas from the start of the first commercial tests available all the way to the future. And I want to thank you for taking time out for being with us, and thank you for your support of Gesher Galicia that you render. And have a great 2025.
Well, the same to you, and thank you so much for having me on. It was absolutely my pleasure.